Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Is the Trump administration currently running concentration camps at the border? Somewhat remarkably, this is a debate we are now having in the year 2019, as the administration builds out day by day a sprawling and ever-expanding system of irregular detention for desperate migrants who the president rails against and vilifies at every turn. Of course, many of the president's apologists have attempted to turn this urgent humanitarian and moral crisis into a debate over what freshman Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called them.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border, and that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps.
Those comments had set off a firestorm of both good faith and bad faith criticism, and there are legitimate reasons to object to the use of that term in the context. As many pointed out, direct allusions to, invocations of the horror of the Holocaust are always treacherous territory. The term concentration camp, though it predates the Nazi regime and applies to many camps operated throughout the world throughout history, is, in the public imagination of the U.S., intimately tied to the machinery of death that the Nazis constructed. Analogies to the Nazis always run the danger of cheapening the sheer scope of the horror of the Holocaust. What we confront right now in the U.S. is not genocide or mass murder. In fact, the discomforting truth is that, in fact, an expansion of a set of systems already workshopped by the last Democratic president. But good faith objections aside, there was also swift, massive efforts made to turn Cortez's comments into their own controversy by people who have shown absolutely no concern whatsoever over the conditions for the human beings inside those camps themselves, or the fact that at least 7 children are known to have died in immigration custody since last year. These are 3 of those children: 8-year-old Felipe Gomez Alonso, 16-year-old Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez. They were both suffering from the flu when they died in CBP custody. CBP says 7-year-old Jacqueline Kahl Makin died from an infection that shut down her vital organs. According to her family, she was well fed and in good health when she arrived at the border with her father. Now, before these deaths of those children, no child had died in CBP custody for nearly a decade. Something is wildly, horribly wrong. Children are dying in our care and custody, yet so many of those in high dudgeon over the words of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have shown absolutely zero concerns about the deaths of these children, zero concern about the administration ripping literally thousands of children, even infants, from their parents' arms, zero concern about the U.S. currently accepting fewer refugees fleeing war and oppression than any administration in recent U.S. history.
I think Congresswoman AOC needs to apologize, not only to the nation, but to the world.
This type of rhetoric from our elected leaders is irresponsible, reckless, misinformed, and wrong.
We've had a long history, if you go back, at people who really are left-wing zealots, ignoring history, ignoring facts to pursue their causes. At some point, you just sort of run out of ways to describe how ignorant this is.
Yes, the rhetoric, the ignorance. Instead of an honest reckoning with this administration's policies, professional legacy cases like Donald Trump Jr. and Liz Cheney, along with the other opportunists in their party, try to score a cheap rhetorical point in bad faith, something we should note they are well practiced at and something that will only intensify as we march towards the election. But no amount of debased and craven news cycle trolling can adequately obscure the moral stakes here. The President of the United States was greeted for his kickoff rally for his campaign yesterday by white supremacist supporters flashing white power signs. One reporter quoted a disillusioned GOP operative who said the Trump campaign is well aware of the organized participation of Proud Boy rallies merging into Trump events. They don't care. And we know how the president feels about gatherings of avowed Nazis and white supremacists like the ones who marched in Charlottesville.
You had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
It's the same president who uses all the darkest rhetoric of authoritarian nationalism to rail against the shadowy forces of internal enemies. He accuses immigrants of infesting the country like vermin, the way that, yes, Nazis talked about Jews and others. This rhetoric has been made into policy on the ground, where right now, under our noses, a vast system of irregular and unjust detention is being constructed that will be very, very difficult to unbuild, where migrants are held in what DHS's own Inspector General describes as egregious conditions. Today, Ocasio-Cortez tweeted in response to the performative outrage over her comments, quote, DHS ripped thousands of their children from their parents and put them in cages with inhumane conditions. They call their cells dog pounds and freezers. I will never apologize for calling these camps what they are. If that makes you uncomfortable, fight the camps, not the nomenclature. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.